So, Iranian and Russian news banned in the UK, first by the telecoms cartel and then by Ofcom. Us cancelled off Bristol Community FM by the Bristol Mafia and a chap called Patrick Hart, the station manager, but not cancelled here quite yet. So welcome to the studio, Joe Banks. Hi, Joe.
Hi there. Thank you for having me. It's very nice to see you both again.
I think we're going to just literally start with a look here at Bristol, and particularly, I mean, I think the reason I think this is an important thing to do, we look at all the international stuff as well, let's go right from one side to the other, is in a way we've got a microcosm here of what's going on in the wider world. You know, what's going on in other cities in Europe, other cities in Britain, particularly Britain though, because Bristol is a city which over the years it built up, particularly during the Industrial Revolution. There were all sorts of reasons for the city to be here, not least of which was the port, the harbour, shipping stuff in and out. That all moved out to Avonmouth and Portbury Docks, right, which is at the other end of the gorge to us here on the Bristol Channel. And of course, there are still quite a few ships that are not even interested in going there. They will go to somewhere like Harwich or another port around the country somewhere that even the Bristol Channel's a bit too small for them. So the city has kind of lost its reason to be so big and to be here. And in the meantime, there's quite a lot of land being freed up, isn't there, in the city, for all sorts of reasons, for the developers to kind of get their teeth into. And there's lots of money to be made doing this. Yeah.
Well, the door has been opened to the developers in a massive way by the Mayor of Bristol, Marvin, Rees, and it's something pretty. When you start getting a sense of the scale of what's going on in Bristol, it's pretty extraordinary. That this last week the Bristol University signed contracts with the construction company Sir Robert McAlpine for their £500 million enterprise campus, which just forms one part of this enormous regeneration, this Temple Quarter regeneration scheme, which is the UK's largest regeneration scheme and one of the largest in the whole of Europe. And it forms that, and that in itself just forms one part of this ribbon development that's which is ongoing or coming down the line, which runs all the way in the east. It's basically 3 miles long. It runs in the east from St Philip's Causeway right across, pretty much following the line of the Avon New Cut, the river that was created at the start of the 19th century, along there to Cumberland Basin in the west.
The New Cut was a sort of bypass to the harbour, wasn't it? So the harbour, the floating harbour was created.
Take the tide around the harbour.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it goes from east to west. And this strip is 3 mile long of all these different developments, runs pretty much alongside that. And one of the major things is this Temple Quarter, which is the university, which is also the very controversial Temple Island site, which was going to be an arena, which the previous mayor had all lined up, and then that got overturned in this very stitched up way when Marvin Rees came in, and the arena then got pushed out to the northern fringes of the city.
You use quite moderate language most of the time. Stitched up.
Yes, no, I mean, yeah, undeniably, yeah.
Why?
I mean, when you go through that whole process, all the information that's emerged through freedom of information requests, through the scrutiny that happened in the council. We can go into that now if you want.
Well, we can. I think it's a good idea to explain that this is basically the industrial heart of the city. St Philip's, for example, is all industrial area, and as that industry, and maybe bring Martin, as the industry's been run down in the city, suddenly this has created all these opportunities. We had a very similar thing happening in London, didn't we, in the 1980s and 90s, early 90s, with Docklands. And so there are these zones where the planning rules are less strict, and they have a kind of a small group of people that will make planning decisions rather than the ordinary elected local authorities, in order to try and speed up the planning process. And that kind of thing is going, I think they used to call it them development corporations or something, where they would really bypass the democratic planning system in order to get big developments done on old industry.
Enterprise zones.
Enterprise zones now, yeah, okay. Well, that was... I'm afraid I'm using 1980s speak here.
Well, and that came from what George Osborne...
So, Martin, what's going on here? We've got a city that's sort of lost its reason to be here through industry and through bringing all those people together for industry. But all it seems to be able to do now, what we seem to be seeing, is this being used just as a the transforming of land into property, which is used for either not industrial, anything but industrial. Either here, like you've got student accommodation, luxury housing, and that sort of thing. So it's a complete change, really, in the emphasis in this part of the city.
Well, I don't think there's an enterprise zone in Bristol, is there? It's the council that's decided all
no,
of this.
No, it's Temple Quarter Enterprise Zone.
All right, so it's been made into an enterprise zone.
Yeah, George Osborne. That was announced back in 2012 by George Osborne.
Okay, well, I didn't know that. Well, I mean, obviously, what these enterprise zones are, I mean, what happened in the Isle of Dogs and Canary Wharf and all the rest of it, this was a rundown Docklands area. And it's a very well-established thing now for those areas to be completely transformed into high-end property development, because living near a harbour or working near a harbour is very desirable. You know, I mean, back in the day when these places were ports, they were rather ne'er-do-well sort of places. And the studies have done like that. They put walls around the London docks so that everybody could be checked going in and out to make sure that the dockers weren't thieving everything off the ships. And of course, that was part of the sort of struggle that went on back in the 19th century. But of course, with containerisation, those old harbours and ports all over the world have now become available for development, and the kind of development which has been very successful in terms of making money for some people elsewhere, like Docklands, that's exactly presumably what they're thinking about doing here in Bristol.
Well, that's the industry's gone too, hasn't it? There used to be things like Bristol buses, making buses, shipping them around the world.
Bristol had a fairly diversified economy compared to somewhere like Liverpool. So, I mean, obviously the docks in Liverpool, there's hardly any ships going to Liverpool now. I mean, you see the occasional cruise liner coming in, and the dock side itself has been transformed into, luxury housing and so on. And it's quite attractive. It's not the same as it was. But of course, if you go to Liverpool, and I was there not long ago, it's not as prosperous as Bristol because, as I say, the economy is not as diversified. Bristol has always had quite a diversified economy with some light industry and various other things going on, university and all the rest of it. I mean, in a way, having a university development park, where they're going to try and get the science departments of the university to develop new products is not necessarily a bad idea. But of course, underlying all of this is the big rip-off that is the property market in this country, where it just rises in price, but through land banking and other manipulations. I mean, that should all be really captured by taxation. It shouldn't be going to the private pockets of private people.
It's it's high-tech industry in Bristol that's really being pushed now.
Yes, of course, and that makes sense in a way, doesn't it? Because we're not going to be building steam engines anymore around here. Yeah,
but the university is then becoming an arm of that.
Yes, well, it's quite clear that universities are a key entrepreneurial function. They used to be sort of ivory tower places to some extent, but they're not anymore because most modern products are the result of scientific research. They're not somebody tinkering away in their garage, and that's the whole point. Is you try and, I mean, it's not in principle a bad idea. It's just a question of how you put it into practice. And there's probably lots of other things going on there. Luxury flats, for example, for which there's much less justification.
Yeah. Okay, so the area is called Temple Quarter. It's just on the end of Temple Meads Station. I'm not sure what the final platform's called at Temple Meads. It must be platform 12, 13 or something, right at the very end.
They're putting 3 more entrances into Temple Meads as well.
Yeah, so they're going to transform the station a bit, but there's a whole area around there. Now, so you use this word, stitched up, or this expression, to describe what happened at Temple Island, and that I find And particularly interesting because this was a site which had been cleared with the promise of a sort of, well, basically a public event space for, well, not this, obviously it's a paid for thing, so people have to pay to go. It's not all free or anything, but it was going to be an exciting public space right next to Bristol Temple Mead Station as a sort of way of saying, well, we've got all this land, masses of land here, a lot of it is public land, and we're going to make sure at least some of it is going to be used by the Joe public, and it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it, to have it next to the station so people can come to a concert, a gig, whatever it is they're going to there, a rally by a evangelical, a religious person or something. It could be anything. Yeah. But then they can hop on the train and they can go back home, back to Weston-super-Mare, Chippenham or wherever it is on the train, and it's a very sensible place to put it. But no, so why do you use that expression, stitched up? What happened there?
Well, when you look at the way it was done and the people that did it and the way it was done, it was done in a very unaccountable way. You've got this Malaysian global infrastructure company, YTL, who already owned the old aircraft hangars, Brabazon aircraft hangars in Filton.
Right, so hang on, because just to stop you for a second, because that would have been BAE Systems land that they would have sold to them, because BAE Systems inherited Filton Airfield, and this is 10 miles or so north of Bristol, isn't it? This is up in South Gloucestershire.
It's right on the border with South Gloucestershire. Yeah. And you had things going on like so Marvin Rees, the mayor of Bristol, was flown from. He was on a visit to China in late 2017. He was then flown to Malaysia to have meetings. He was put up in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Kuala Lumpur.
Very nice, yeah.
Had all where I think Obama had stayed previously.
The Bilderbergers used the Ritz-Carltons quite a lot as well. Yeah.
And had all his meals paid for. This was all paid for by YTL. And in the background, you've got people working for Bristol City Council who had previously worked for YTL. And they got to a situation where they wanted YTL. They wanted to give the go-ahead to this arena in the north of Bristol. But they had to get past something called the sequential test in planning, which means that if you've got an area available in the city centre, that has to have primacy over an out of town or out of city.
Because our previous mayor George Ferguson had actually deliberately scheduled several chunks of land, saying, "Well, I don't know what's going to happen in here, but I want it to make sure it's public." For example, one right on the dockside, which has been sold for development as a hotel. Ferguson made sure that it was supposed to be there only for a public, something like a museum or that sort of thing. If someone wanted to build a museum there, it was guaranteed for that. But we've seen that whole thing overturned, and now that being sold off for a hotel. So there's been a mass privatisation by this Labour mayor of quite a lot of things. So now we're going to get. What are we going to get on Temple Island?
Well,
this is actually a little bit of land which it's not really an island. It's just got a great big wall and a road which cuts it off, but it does have the new cut, which is sort of the River Avon running along one side of it. And there was this famous bridge built across. In fact, there's two bridges built across, one pedestrian bridge and one road bridge, which are known locally as the roads to nowhere because they've been there for something like a decade now, and yet nothing's been built. So the roads have been built. All the basic infrastructure for something to happen there has been taking place, but no development so far.
Well, what the officers in Bristol Council had to do very quickly was get a deal with someone to take on that land, get that sort of sealed up, and then they would be able to get permission for the arena at Filton. So they quickly did a deal with Legal & General, to use that land, and gave them this fantastic deal, where Bristol City Council would spend £32 million getting the land ready for them. Legal and General would have a 250-year lease, and Bristol City Council would guarantee rent on the office space for 40 years.
Well, this is a bit cheeky because Marvin was selling this idea of the arena, saying, well, actually, we don't want to do the arena because the City Council might be liable at some point in the future. Well, obviously, the City Council might be liable with this Legal and General deal too. So what's
going to be there is a conference centre, a 345 room hotel, 550 new homes, and these 2 Grade A office buildings, and there's a bit of land there that's also owned by the university that will be student accommodation.
But surely that's quite a good thing to have there. The students are going to enjoy being next to the station, aren't they?
Yeah. That also opens up another question of what the university involvement was in this whole deal, because initially, when it was going to be an arena, quite a bit of that university accommodation was going to be on their site, their enterprise campus site. And then when this whole deal went through, they then put all their student accommodation onto Temple Island. So it seems to me that it would have been in their interest for this not to have been an arena as well. And they're such a powerful player in this whole enterprise zone.
Yeah.
Although publicly they've said that they said all along, we have no preference. If the city wants an arena or doesn't want an arena, we don't mind. But it seems to me they must have been involved in working this all out as well.
How come, Martin? How come the university's become such a major player in the city? In the way in the past it was sort of sitting in the background. It's got loads of its old buildings. If it wanted some new space, it usually would do something like either buy a little piece of land or else knock down an old building, put up a new one.
Well, they've always been fairly major players in the city.
Well, they're expanding massively here.
Well, of course, yes, because because of the kind of incentives that are on university managers now, they need to expand in order to function, because they've got to bring in foreign students to pay the fees, because the caps on student fees and the fact that many students don't actually pay the money back. They're becoming more commercially oriented.
Right. Well, exactly. This is another side of all this, where the university is saying that they are now expecting an increase of nearly 5,000 new students every year, Joe.
They've had an increase of 10,000 over the last 10 years.
Right, and another 5,000 now.
Yeah.
So is the idea that these people come because they're getting a brilliant education here and they're getting it in English, and that English is a good language to get your education in?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the selling propositions for people to come here and study is 2 things. A, that it's in English, and many people learn English in school wherever they come from, China included. And
it's a way to top up your English, isn't it, as well?
Oh, yes, of course. I mean... And then, of course, the other thing is, I mean, when the government were negotiating, for example, with Narendra Modi about some potential trade deal with India, one of the things that he was demanding is that students who come here to study should be allowed to stay and work afterwards, because then they can put remittances back to India and so on and so forth. And this is globalisation. This is what it looks like. And, of course, that does create huge problems for local people who are trying to get somewhere decent to live if you've got very wealthy students coming from outside who are going to bid up the prices for property.
One of the criticisms of this, Joe, is a great article in the Bristol Cable I'll put a link up to on our show page at thisweek.org.uk. They're talking here about pseudo-public space. So, I mean, admittedly, the arena is it's a bit like a football stadium. It's not public space, it's nearly public space. But the university isn't really going to have much of an interest there for ordinary citizens in Bristol. And that's the basic point that they're making in the cable, is they're saying, well, there was something that everybody might have been going to. The university is not like that.
No, well, and it's legal and general as well. And they they come out with all this very, very friendly stuff about what their intentions are, how they want to be a place for the whole city. You can't help but being a bit sceptical about that.
Well, what they're also saying is that, you know, that as people, I mean, I'll just read a little bit of the article. She said, it says, on a spring day last year, Heidi Severade was walking her dog with a friend through Temple Quay in central Bristol. Stopping by the river for coffee, the pair were enjoying a brief bask in the sun when a private security guard came out of an adjacent building and told them to leave. Confused as to what her crime could possibly be, 39-year-old Heidi asked the security guard why they weren't allowed to drink coffee in what was a public area by the riverfront. The security guard told her the site was private and they had to move on. There's something very uncomfortable about being turned away like some sort of nuisance when you're just standing around unaware that you're breaking any laws, she said.
Yeah. So I mean, this is happening all over the city as well. That's happening at, I've spoken to you before about the St Mary Laporte development. And you can see in the emails, the Freedom of Information emails there, that they're talking about the land deal, you know, that they're making with the developer, and that's on the edge of Castle Park, and that, and they talk up public realm. You know, this is going to have great improvements to public realm, but the fact of it, you know, it's absolutely not public realm; it's private realm, and ultimately they can stop you being there if they don't want you to be there.
Martin Fodor is a Green councillor in Bristol, one of the best. He used to be on our show very regularly when we were in BCFM, Martin. He's saying finding a preferred partner is well established, but a deal signed behind closed doors is not the same process as running it as an open tender, he says. Green councillor for Redland, he sits on a number of these various scrutiny commissions. He's saying, actually, this deal was handed to Legal & General. There was no proper public bidding process for it at all.
Well, you'd have thought that the Greens have set fair possibly to take control of the council come, not this May, but the following May. But, of course, no doubt by that stage, all of this stuff will already be...
These major property deals will all be done.
It'll all be done, so that even if they wanted to change their minds about it, they can't. But I think it is, you know, obviously the Green Party, who are becoming a bigger force in the city, might not have signed a lot of this off. And, of course, that's the argument for having a mayor, you see. So instead of having all these endless arguments about we're not doing that and we're not doing that and there's the objections here and objections there, you can just bulldoze it through. Isn't that the whole point of having a mayor?
And you have people... So the person who did sign that off was a guy called Colin Moulton, who was the... who came in 2017, basically to oversee what was happening with the arena. And he had been, prior to that, he had been the chief executive at Homes England, or the Housing and Communities Agency, which is an arm, a sort of a government body that's looking to increase housing, a kind of housing accelerator. He came into Bristol City Council in 2017 after receiving a redundancy payment of £95,000 from Homes England. He was then on a kind of a self-employment contract, which meant that he was being paid £263,000 a year.
Well, I do hope that his contract was being paid to a company in the Cayman Islands, and then he was then using that company to pay himself, because then he wouldn't have had to pay any tax at all, which is what a lot of these people who are in on these kind of freelance contracts with the council, that's what a lot of them do.
Well, talking about the Cayman Islands, YTL... are also in the Cayman Islands.
This is the developer, the
Malaysian developer.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, isn't it? Well, I mean, you might wonder, well, why is Malaysia in charge of all of this? You know, owning all this land. I mean, this is just a bit of a joke, really, isn't it? But if you look at Malaysia, you'll see over the last few years there's been a whole load of financial corruption over there with this 1MDB scandal. $3 billion. Goldman Sachs have been told they've got to pay over that, and it's been one of the places over the last few years which is in the centre of corruption, and this is where there were various arrests made, including the former Prime Minister and former well, I don't know what they call it in Malaysia, but Chancellor in Malaysia arrested because the government were actually complicit in this. Well, it looks to me like what we've got here is we've got big developers making a lot of money with our elected representatives complicit with this.
Yeah, and this merry-go-round of people who were going in and out of the public sector, going from the public sector to the private sector. There was another Bristol City Council officer, Barry McRory, who was another senior city council boss overseeing the arena, who went...
Sorry, he was a councillor or was an officer?
No, this is an officer.
Oh, officer, right.
On 136 grand a year.
Wow.
And he left Bristol City Council in 2017 to go and work for YTL. And now he's working for the university. You know, so it's this merry-go-round.
So the reason we're talking about this is the shovels have just been stuck in, haven't they, this week?
They've just signed contracts
into Temple Island
to
start building this. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure you've had a good look at the plans, Joe. I mean, it doesn't seem to me as if you could even cram another skyscraper on there. What they've done with it is, rather than sort of keep it in keeping with the surrounding area, and it's actually slightly higher than, for example, the parts of St Philip's, the other side of the new cut, is to put skyscrapers on it. I mean, it doesn't look to me as if this is in any way trying to make it look reasonable as you're viewing it from the surrounding area. It just looks like the same old. How high can we build up? How many square feet of floor space that we can then rent out can we put on here? Yeah.
It's a feeding frenzy, isn't it?
I mean, it really does look incredible. I will promise to put up a picture on our show page at thisweek.org.uk of the projected development, because it really it's so ugly and it's ridiculous. If you can imagine a little part of the city, a bend in the river, and then getting a whole load of Lego bricks, about 10 Lego bricks high, and seeing how many you can cram into that small area. That's what they've done. Yeah. Martin, I mean, it does seem like there isn't really any planning system anymore. It's a kind of free-for-all here.
Well, it was always weak, but it's got weaker and weaker. And people still think, you know, if you talk to people in pubs and so on, they still think that the council in some way controls this stuff and that they make decisions about it. Whereas in actual fact, I worked for the council briefly. My experience would be that the developers pretty much run the show, and the council's opposition is relatively muted. Even if the council was run by the Greens and they wanted to oppose all of this, they'd still find it quite difficult because the law is against them. You know, the law in Britain is that the developers should be allowed to develop unless there's a good reason not, rather than we're not going to change anything until we can be sure we want to change it. And that's always been the case in Britain. It's we're a buccaneering sort of a place, aren't we?
It's been turned up to the max in Bristol.
Oh yeah.
To the point where things are going on. You've got the councillor Nicola Beech, who has the responsibility for strategic planning in the city. She worked for a PR consultancy for developers before she came into Marvin Rees's cabinet.
Well, perfect PR, isn't it? To be actually making the decision.
You've got another Labour councillor, young Eastville councillor, Marley Bennett, who about 3 months ago started working for Turley, a full-service planning and development consultancy, who were actually one of the consortium of consultants who did the master planning for Temple Quarter, and are deeply involved in getting stuff through planning, for developers in Bristol all over the country, and this guy sits on the Growth and Regeneration Scrutiny Committee. It seems to me things have got very, very bad indeed.
Well, yeah, particularly you've got the poachers turn gatekeepers. That's
in a democratic sense.
Well, yeah, the councillors are supposed to be the poachers, aren't they?
They're supposed to have some independence. Because if you've got someone there who's working for, a planning and development consultancy, then that person won't be employed if he's any kind of threat to that business's clients. And you have to have people, democratically elected people, who are prepared to threaten the interests of developers. Yeah. That's not to say they've always got to oppose them, but there will be occasions where the interest of the developer does not align with the public interest.
Just looking at again at this business of the arena moving from right next to Temple Meads, which is the obvious place to put it, as George Ferguson said, really central, easy to get to in and out, and even people who live in central Bristol can just walk there. But no, we're going to have it up at Filton Airfield because that's where our people own some land, and they're going to. I mean, they did exactly the same, and I say they. I mean the city fathers who I was on the cultural development partnership with back in the late noughties, and we had a wrangle at the time saying, well, what you're going to put this aerospace museum in Filton, how are people going to get to it? Who's going to see it there? Who's going to go to it? And do you know what's happened now? It's nearly bankrupt because it's run out of money. There's nobody going to the aviation museum up there. I think it's called Aerospace Bristol, and they're just hoping that by piling, I think, more and more and more activities up there, that hopefully people will start going to Filton. But the fact is, Filton is right at the top north end of the city, and the communications around there are awful. So these people have just decided, well, we're going to do all this stuff in the place where the land is convenient to do it. And actually what's happened, Martin, is the planning system has completely gone out the window. There's no strategic planning in here whatsoever. It's all just about money.
Well, if you look at the whole development of Aztec West in the 1980s, that's because of the M4, M5 interchange there. And in previous era, they wouldn't have been allowed to do anything much with it. But in the Thatcher era, they just said, well, do what you want with it.
Well, that's right. What's happening now, you're quite right.
A whole new city almost grew up around Aztec West.
Well, apparently cars are going out.
There was no kind of thought about what infrastructure was required or anything.
Apparently, the internal combustion engine and the diesel engine are going out of fashion. And yet, all along our motorways, you're seeing more and more and more development taking place. Chippenham, another massive...
What happened to Swindon? I mean, it used to be a kind of run-down little train town.
So the motorways are going to have all these...
the most developing, the fastest growing town in Britain.
Well, you can look and see where the people are buying up land alongside motorways.
Another aspect of the YTL Arena thing is that actually they are getting all this public transport infrastructure put in for them to get people to their arena. Which is being paid, by the West of England Combined Authority.
So people come in to get to Temple Meads on the train, and then they'll get something else that will take them to the arena. Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is a total waste. It seems public money is just spent on, This is Martin. This is
partnership.
Well, no. This is corporate welfare.
It is.
Can I mention Colin Skellett?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
So this is another. I just find it absolutely mind blowing. How interlinked these people are. So Colin Skellett is the chief executive of Wessex Water. The company who are polluting the River Avon that runs through Bristol. He's also Wessex Water is owned by YTL, and he is the chief executive of the YTL UK group of companies, which includes the Arena complex of Filton. He's also the chair of Business West, which is the big business lobbying group in the west of England. And he was also, it's worth mentioning, in 2002 he was arrested in a dawn raid at his home in Bath on suspicion of accepting a £1 million bribe during the takeover of Wessex Water by YTL, which I should say he was cleared of all charges.
Of course. Merchant venturer?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, well, see, this is in the way. This is really, I think, what's going on. I mean, for example, Wessex Water, as we were discussing a couple of weeks ago, Martin, was privatised in the Thatcher years, and so much of what we're seeing now is a result of those Thatcher years, isn't it?
It is, because if the water companies were not privatised, then they couldn't be part of this merry-go-round that's being described.
I think Bristol Water was one of the only private water companies in the country.
No, Bristol Water has always been private and still is, but Wessex Water...
That's where you'll find these merchant venturers.
And it was taken over ultimately by Enron. So when Enron went bust, Wessex Water were implicated in that. And of course...
We mustn't complain too much, but both Joe and I are taking a sip of the stuff right now.
It's delicious.
I totally take on board all the detail that's coming out here about how corrupt this is, but the overall structure of things means that it's facilitated. I mean, of course, after 30 or 40 years of just going, do what you like, this is what you end up with.
One last point. I've got to make this last little point. So, I think it illustrates the depth of the problem. I wanted to make a complaint to Bristol City Council about the fact this councillor is working for a planning and development consultancy while he's on the Growth and Regeneration Scrutiny Committee. It's a very obvious conflict of interest.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I was initially told by the monitoring officer, the person responsible for overseeing probity within the council, that it's down to the councillor to recuse himself if they feel there's a conflict of interest, where evidently there's going to be a conflict of interest in anything they do on that committee, because everything is connected to the environment in which these developers operate. And so I thought, okay, I discovered that there's a subcommittee at Bristol City Council, an ethics and values subcommittee. Maybe I could get in touch with them, get in touch with the chair of that subcommittee. Yeah. Surely they would be interested in this sort of conflict of interest. I looked the person up, and who are they but none other than a director of Business West. So it's this sort of Kafkaesque situation where you got nowhere to tell. There's no democratic.
Well, it'd be interesting to put in a complaint anyway and see if it gets anywhere. But this whole issue of probity, there isn't any. Let's just be frank. There is no probity in this city anymore. And one of the things that should happen, and does happen occasionally, is that the opposition councillors scrutinise. Is there any sign of that going on?
Well, I find that disappointing. I find the Greens pretty disappointing in their inability to actually hold the administration to account, and I think that's partly because there just aren't. I mean, the system, the mayoral system, doesn't give them much opportunity to do that. But I find that the level of debate, the ability of people to put an argument together in the council chamber is pretty weak.
Yeah, well, we have two main events, don't we? We have the cabinet, which is Marvin Rees chairing, and there's a certain amount of scrutiny of his cabinet. It's his little hand-picked bunch of people that get paid a bit more than the other councillors.
There's no scrutiny of that within the cabinet. I mean, they're all
They just nod away,
and they just nod things through.
But the full council is actually chaired, I think, reasonably well by the Lord Mayor, whereas Cabinet is a particularly nasty arena in this city, and I thought it would be interesting to have a listen. We were talking about Martin Fodor and his sterling work, the Green councillor, in questioning what's been going on at Temple Island earlier. And I think this is maybe one of the reasons why we don't get much questioning like this, is because I'm going to play you a clip now of a recent cabinet meeting with the Mayor Marvin Rees chairing the meeting, and the clip starts with one of his friends, Dave Redgewell, who's been around for a long time. I've got to know, he's got very close to the city fathers, and to see the way Marvin Rees deals with him, and whether or not he's, this is the chair, remember, and of course the flavour of the city is really set by whoever chairs the council, and you can get and also you'll get I think a pretty clear flavour of why people don't necessarily want to ask the mayor difficult questions at cabinet. And so the first what we'll be hearing is Marvin Rees, and then we'll hear a selection of little clip where it's a quite long clip where the councillor for Redland, the Green councillor for Redland, Martin Fodor, attempts to ask a question at cabinet with Marvin Rees, the mayor, chairing it.
I'm letting you have another statement there rather than a question, but you are Dave Redgewell, so that's okay.
Of course, also park groups, which was
right,
specifically...
Can we do the question, please?
Yeah. What arrangements are there from...
You do answer. There's a bit of a... This is a political chamber, and so we do have to talk about... You do realise you didn't actually support the budget. We don't need to get into it now, but it's only real support if you're actually involved in the decision that allocates the money. It's not real support if you just identify the money but then don't vote for that money to be put into the budget. And if you don't support the budget, you have not actually supported the spending that the council's going to do. And I mean, because I get you're pointing about all the support that was in the chamber, but that didn't actually happen because one of the parties didn't support the budget at all. And it's important. that we do that, because this is a place in which we make serious decisions in a complicated city in the face of competing demands under incredible financial pressure. And making those decisions, you can't always take the easy line of saying what you believe without actually making decisions about where the money's going to get spent and where the money's not going to get spent. As Joe Biden said, don't tell me what you believe, show me your budget. If you haven't got a budget, there's no evidence of what you believe. That's the easy route, and it's not serious political leadership in the city. But having said that, Ellie, please, would you like to respond about how people will be involved in that? Okay, do you have a supplementary, but please make it a question?
Yeah, I think suggestions that come forward for this particular
piece
of money.
Please, Mike, can we have a question?
Yeah, I'd like to know if you intend to keep any proposals that come for this piece of money, because there is the second capital spend coming. So they are.
Will you keep the proposals that come from this money? I think is the question.
So that's an incredible bit of chairing, supposedly chairing there, not actually allowing Martin Fodor to ask his question. And the long and short of it is, well, you didn't support the budget, so how can you ask a question about what's happened with the budget? You can't. You're not allowed to. I'm not going to allow you to. I'm the mayor. I'm in charge. It doesn't come across very well, Joe, actually, to have somebody. I mean, literally, he's been accused of bullying by many people, but he's not a chair who's trying to bring in all views, hear all views, and tease out a consensus. He's already decided that certain questions are hostile questions and are not going to be allowed to be asked, even though this is supposed to be a democratic forum.
Yeah, I find his approach very, very uninspiring, and particularly hypocritical, because he's always giving these pompous lectures about people bringing the debate down in the council chamber and the lack of nuance, and he's constantly attacking the tone of opposition councillors.
I don't think he really understands opposition, Martin. He's even quite cheeky there with that Green councillor, Martin Fodor. He's saying, well, actually, no, that's not the question. I'll tell you what your question was, and this is what it was.
Well, obviously, I didn't hear obviously, I heard the clip, but I wasn't, obviously the background to it all is somewhat opaque to me. I think the fundamental problem is the mayoral system. It gives anybody, I mean, when George Ferguson was the mayor, he chose to have a more consensual style, but that was entirely up to him. He didn't have to do that. And the problem with the mayoral system is it really is designed as originally thought of. The Tories thought of it on the back of a fag packet.
Is he a sort of CEO then?
Yes, that's exactly how he sees himself. And did you see he mentioned Joe Biden there? Because he sees himself, because he's married to an American, he studied at US universities, he sees that this is the way things are done. He sees himself as a kind of reincarnation of Mayor Daley or something of this sort. That's how he sees himself. And of course, incidentally, I'm a member of the Labour Party, and I perhaps shouldn't say this, but he's probably going to be the Labour candidate in Felton. So having an arena up there which provides some work for locals who might vote for him, well, that wasn't necessarily being against his interest, would it? But I mean, he would just say that's hardball political stuff. That's what they do in the US. That's what we've got to do. We've got to be more like the US. And I don't agree with that, but they see where he's coming from.
I would also suggest, if anyone's interested in following what's going on here in Bristol, we've got a very good freelance journalist whose name is Joanna Booth. She is the wife of the editor of one of the local papers, and or it's at least an online paper. It was started by an ex-Bristol Post journalist using his redundancy money, and it's extremely good to have as many organs as we can here scrutinising what's going on. But Jo's Twitter handle is Still Awake. That's at Still Awake if you want to follow her. But we can round up, I think, by looking at the plans to demolish Bristol Centre NCP car park for tower blocks moves forwards. Developers describe it as a run-down building in a neglected part of town, but some are saying that they want it to stay, this car park. Now, of course, this is another side effect of the clean air zone and people being charged to bring cars in, is suddenly all these car parks, we can knock them down and build a skyscraper.
Yeah. Yes, this is a sort of brutalist car park, but some people see it as a.
So this is a style of architecture, yeah.
Yeah, brutalism, and there's that whole area along Rupert Street in Lewins, Mead was all, rebuilt post-war. And some people see something quite attractive in that particular
student accommodation going in there. Surprise.
Well, what I was going to say is that they're actually, managing to make this very grim part of Bristol even worse, which is quite an achievement.
This is another side effect, isn't it, of these policies? We're told it's all about clean air, Martin, but actually, oh dear, there's all these. I mean, there's one of the car parks off Baldwin Street it's about to be demolished. It's been closed. This is all development opportunities going on here. And I do wonder if there's really almost anything else going on in this country where people can make money other than knocking things down and building luxury flats.
Well, this is the point I was going to make, is this is all dependent upon lines of finance which are dependent upon international financial system remaining stable. And it may well be that we'll get halfway through building all this stuff and then the cranes will just grind to a halt. In fact, I predict that's what will happen.
Oh, are you telling me that these international students aren't coming?
No, the international students will come. It's the finance for it which will fall down, because when the banking system is still incredibly unstable, people presume that it's all sorted since 2008. But what we saw happening in California and so on, and something like that will, in the very near future, I suggest, it may be, if it happens quickly enough, it'll stymie all of this. Well, which is probably a better result than getting halfway through with it and then being stymied.
Yeah. The whole scheme is meant to take up to 25 years, to happen.
Yeah. So, and there isn't going to be any downturn in the next 25 years. I think that's most unlikely.
The other thing is flooding as well, which is a big threat, because the whole thing, this whole ribbon, a 3-mile long ribbon of development, most of it sits right, in the areas most at threat of flooding in Bristol.
Well, I suppose if you're on the top floor of these flats, that won't be such a problem, but you won't be able to get out.
Yeah.
There's another thing that they don't seem to have thought about at all, which is with all these extra students and all these extra luxury flats and even affordable houses, which don't seem to be being built at all anymore because there's not enough money in it for the land speculators. South Bristol GPs and schools won't cope with 12,000 extra homes, claims MP. This is Karen Smith, another fairly regular guest on our BCFM programme. More than 12,000 new homes are either being built or planned for South Bristol right now, but the area's MP is calling for someone to own the problem. Make sure there's enough GPs, surgeries, healthcare centres and schools. Karen Smith has told Bristol Live, that's the Bristol Post, local newspaper, the people of South Bristol do not have confidence in the huge numbers of new homes being built. So there's, on the one hand, Martin, you've got all these projected, we must have new homes, but they're not building the infrastructure to service them.
Yeah, and also when they say new homes, it's nothing. We're not talking about homes for poorer people, which is where the real issue is. The people who will come and live in those homes, if they get built and if they get sold, will be mainly from outside Bristol. The city will grow and become prosperous, but it won't necessarily be for the locals who've been here all along. I mean, Bristol is a very successful city in many ways compared to other cities in Britain, but it's still got miserable deprivation in certain parts of the city, and that just goes to show that just boosting money into the city doesn't solve those fundamental social problems. It doesn't trickle down. It doesn't, a lot of this stuff is of no help whatsoever to people who are really struggling in Bristol. And of course, in the past, a Labour council in the 40s or the 50s would have had the planning powers, for example, to build council houses. And they would literally, the plan was we're going to put council houses right next to middle class houses, right next door, and they'll all have to go to the same school. And that was the plan. That's what the conception was. And that's, town planning really meant something in that era. Obviously we got new towns like, Milton Keynes and so on being developed on greenfield sites. But even in the major cities, there was a general belief in planning the city. Whereas what's happened now is they just said, well, just let the private sector do what it wants and we will facilitate the private sector. That's where we've got to.
Yeah, and we'll have totally meaningless affordable housing percentages that get pushed down and down and down. They never get built.
I mean, you know very well what happens with that. As soon as they get to building it, if there is, for example, a bit of a financial wobble, then they will just say, well, we
Yes.
did say we were going to build you some affordable housing, but now we can't do that.
It's not
because
viable.
It's not viable.
Yeah,
and
or else-
they say, oh, that's all right.
Or else, as we saw here in the boatyard development, it starts to slide into the river because it's been built jutting out over the river, and the river starts to subside beneath it, and so it's condemned.
It's always been a problem with social housing and council housing, is it's been done on the cheap. The reason why tower blocks in the 60s were so unlivable in many respects is because they didn't spend the money on them. You know, they were basically jerry built.
Bristol City Council have come up with another solution, which happened this week, which was just to halve the social housing waiting list by just taking half the people off it, which is what they've done this week. So
how can they do that?
Because they've just said. So the social housing waiting list in Bristol was around 19,000.
Yeah.
And this week they've said that the people in the lower, there are 4 bands of need basically, and those in the lowest band, which is actually about half of that list, are just never going to get a property.
Well, they never were anyway, but at least they're being honest about it.
So they're actually just off the list. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So we've got a problem to solve now.
So many of these
it's down
people,
below 10,000 now.
Many of these people will be have been on there probably for maybe even up to a decade, because the story is in the various places, but it's also in Bristol 24/7. Many residents with low priority housing need are unlikely to find a new home. About half the 19,000 families on Bristol City Council's housing waiting list are being kicked off after bosses admitting them, giving them false hope of ever finding a home. Less than 1% of the 9,500 households considered least urgent are allocated accommodation. There's little or no chance of being successfully housed. In a report to the authorities' leaders, the city's social housing is advertised on the council's Home Choice website, which people on the waiting list can bid on, with those in greatest need usually awarded a property if it is suitable. In fact, I was involved in the consultation when they brought this in, probably a decade or more ago, and we all pointed out the people on this little board they set up back in the old this is in the Ferguson era, or maybe even just before the Ferguson era. So before we had a mayor, when they used to do things properly, and we were saying, well, look, just a minute, what about all the vulnerable people that are, are they going to be able to play this video game and sort of go online and try and click all the buttons in order to get somewhere to live? So basically what has happened now is what we warned of, is the people who are most adept on computers and using the system at Martin are the ones that get the housing often.
That's right, and it used to be allocated on need by the council. There would be a list, and they're saying, right, you've got 3 kids, they've only got 2, you're first, and there was no argument about it. And they used to give you, this is what we've got to offer. I think you did have some power to say, I don't like this for whatever reason. But the thing where you've got to be computer skilled to bid, it's a marketisation of society, isn't it? Everybody is just learning how to play the game, and this is the whole thing about universal credit. You've got to be paid in monthly instalments, and you get all the rent in one. So you learn how to manage your money, even though people who are vulnerable often can't manage their own money. They need the rent to be just paid for them, so that they don't have to mess about with it. And they need not to be told that they should get weekly or 2 weekly payments. That's how it used to be. The reason for having 2 weekly payments is because we know that people have chaotic lives and they can't manage their money. But Ian Duncan Smith's big idea was, we're going to get them all to become little entrepreneurs. It's like, they're disabled. They're never going to do any serious work. They've got to learn how to work. It's just ideology. And of course, what's really this is what a Labour government could easily be like, is this stuff writ large. Starmer has suggested some things which are reasonably radical, like putting GPs on the government payroll. But I bet you see this is what's going on in Manchester as well.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, there's a big. I didn't watch it. Maybe you did. A big BBC series about the developers in Manchester and how they've taken the place over.
Oh yeah, well,
and it's been very successful for them. Huge amount of money made, and Andy Burnham is just sort of presiding over this. Like, I'm trying to help you, but what can I do?
Yeah, well, it would be nice if Marvin, Rees, our mayor, would actually even say, I'm trying to help you, but he doesn't. So funding scrapped and plans paused for electric buses and bike hangers in Bristol. Just sort of beginning to wind up our look at what's going on in the city here and the planning, etc. Because, I mean, this is 250 electric buses and 1,000 bike hangers have just been, the funding's been pulled for them. They're not having those anymore. So that's actually quite a lot of buses, 250 of them. The government has scrapped the funding. So we're being told that because of these emissions, the emission charge, that they want to get cars out of the city. But the thing is, Joe, it seems that the various alternatives, there isn't. I mean, we've had a massive cut in our bus services, etc. Hikes in the price of buses as well. And so just as people are being told you're not allowed to bring your car into the city anymore, so the public transport is either disappearing or becoming unaffordable. It just seems perverse.
It's very weird. It's very weird. It's one of the... And again, it's another one of these strange things about Bristol as a city, that it has, from the outside, it has this reputation as a fantastic green, forward-looking, progressive place. You know, in some ways it is, but you know, it's if you want to get a bus, it's just basically a lottery.
Yes,
you know, you just never know when one will turn up, if it will turn up.
And even the little signs that tell you on the bus stop there's one coming, and then all of a sudden it's come, but there was no bus. So it's what they call the ghost buses.
Yeah.
Look, Martin, what's going on here? Because this is a bigger macroeconomic problem, surely, isn't it? There's just no government doesn't seem to have any money to provide for the services it needs. I mean, you know, the ultimate thing is here, you've got to go on your bike. But if you're elderly or if the weather's pouring down with rain, you can't go on your bike.
Yes, and also Bristol's got loads of hills. It's not like Oxford or Cambridge, is it, in terms of getting on your bike? Well, it's underlying all of this is the acceptance by the Labour Party, including Marvin Rees, that there's a kind of, you know, there are limits to what we can do, and within those limits we make noises about being inclusive and all the rest of it. But the reality is, the bottom line is, we've got to go along with all of this, because what else can we do? And there isn't any willingness to challenge that. Now, obviously, if we had a Corbyn-led Labour Party, you might have seen much more kickback, but that's now been...
Well, I mean, the irony is in the centre, the whole centre of Bristol is changing. You know, what you're seeing is quite a lot of shops closing down, but much more friendly space to walk around. It's just there doesn't seem to be so many people around. So if you go out into the city in the evenings, I don't know if you do this, you two, but I mean, I do it from time to time. Say even on a Thursday night, it's almost dead. You know, so it's almost like they're trying to pedestrianise the city centre, but the pedestrians, in the meantime, just don't seem to have the disposable income to go out and enjoy themselves anymore. Martin?
Well, I mean, the pubs and restaurants have definitely noticed the fact that people aren't spending money because of the cost of living crisis and all the rest of it. And all of this, you see, the macroeconomic environment will make any of this potentially unviable. This is you know, it's no use having loads of chi-chi cafes with you know, £5 lattes if people can't go in them because they haven't got the £5.
You can walk along and you see lots of places shut now. In London, there's a much bigger. Obviously, there's a wider democratic remit there because you've got all the local London boroughs all with their local authorities, and the ULEZ, which is does anyone know what it stands for? Ultra low emission zone. There you go. Which is the extra charge. Mayor Khan, even though he did not say anything about this in his manifesto, is threatening to extend this right out to the M25, so that anybody that uses a car there is likely to have to pay this extra, whatever it is, £12 a day, just to be driving around. Now, there is no alternative in many parts of this, and so the outer London boroughs of Bexley, Bromley, Harrow and Hillingdon, along with Surrey County Council, have launched legal action over the proposed extension of the ULEZ beyond the north and south circular roads. Hillingdon borders Buckinghamshire to the east of Denham. A judge at the High Court this week decided that their bid for a judicial review can go ahead, saying parts of the local authorities' challenge were arguable. Sir Ross Cranston, in a written decision issued on Wednesday, said a one-day hearing should be held in early July. If it goes ahead, the ULEZ will see drivers in outer London pay, here we go, it's £12.50 a day from August 29th. Now, that, of course, means that if you go and visit somebody in London, that's £25 you've got to pay just to go and visit them, never mind everything else you pay. Now, this, of course, is going to try and drive people onto public transport. if you can get a train, if they're not on strike, and if you can afford to do that. So, what do you make of this challenge, Martin? All these mostly conservative boroughs saying, look, locals here can't afford it. It's one of the things that I find so amazing about this is you've got Tories actually sticking up for people with less money. And actually what Labour's doing is it's going to... Because the people who are going to be hit mostly by this £12.50 are the people who can less afford to pay it. Effectively, it's because as a flat rate, it's a... and also it's imposed more on older cars. This is a regressive tax.
Well, I'm not going to try and defend Dulles. I don't really understand the ins and outs of it.
It's very similar to here in Bristol.
Well, I know.
Older cars have to pay it, and poorer people have to pay it.
Well, in that case, you've got to raise benefits and increase taxes on wealthy people if you want to do that sort of thing. Yeah, we should, for example, change our food production.
So why are these Labour mayors? Why are these so-called
messing up the rivers?
Why are these so-called Labour mayors bringing these measures in, which are mostly? I mean, the wealthy. This is just nothing to them. £12.50 a day, fine.
Why? You'd have to ask Khan why he's brought it in. I'm not here to defend his position, but. Don't forget, and this is no doubt, this is what Marvin would say as well, we've had our budget cut by 60% in the last 5 years. We've got we really have taken a huge hit. It's the local authorities that have taken the biggest hit of austerity. I drove past Trinity Road Police Station today, and there it is, a state-of-the-art police station, built presumably by New Labour decision, and there it is, empty, and they're trying to sell it because it was closed down. You know, they'd opened it and then they closed it. And, of course, nobody wants to buy it for flats because it's got no windows. It's a police station. You know, ultimately it'll have to be knocked down and something else will have to be built.
In fact, it's exactly the same as the police building on the opposite side of the road. That happened about maybe 10, 15 years ago. So they closed that one down and moved across the road, and now they're having to close that down too, apparently.
Well, I mean, what strikes me as absurd about that is it's a state-of-the-art, modern-looking police station. I mean, why go ahead and build something like that and then decide because of austerity, because we've got to bail the banks out and supply the Challenger tanks to the Ukraine, we can't afford a police
maybe they're
station.
expecting civil unrest and that it's right in the city centre and that they might be attacked by mobs.
Well, I think what's going on is that there's plenty of money, as we found out during the pandemic. Rishi Sunak was able to press a button and nationalise the whole economy for months at a time. They just don't want it spent on things they don't want it spent on. The reason why they got rid of council housing is because people who lived in council housing, two things, they tended to vote Labour because they were grateful for getting a reasonable home, and B, they could go on strike. Of course, once you're buying your own house, you can't do either of those things so easily. And that's exactly why they did it. And of course, all of this is geared around political decisions. So another thing that's coming up in these local elections is people who haven't got a passport or a driving licence will be turned away from polling stations. Now, that's pretty disgusting to my mind, but of course that is what's going to happen. And many people will turn up expecting to vote as they normally do, and they'll be turned away. I know people in this position.
That is in the next month or so with the local elections.
That's right. And of course what they're hoping is, and they've also redrawn the constituency boundaries on the basis of the existing electoral registers, which if you've been an activist in any of the major cities, you will know loads of people aren't registered to vote. But the Tories don't care about that. If they don't want to register to vote, that's up to them. What they could do, quite straightforwardly, is just register everybody to vote automatically.
The thing is,
and in Australia, it's compulsory to turn up.
Just a minute. There's an absurdity to this voter ID, in that less and less people are bothering to vote anyway.
Well, indeed, the real problem is we've got very limited participation, particularly from the poorest and most marginalised people. They tend to be the people who don't vote because they think there's no point, nobody cares about us, and in a way, they're right. But of course, we should be trying to make the system function for those people and make them see that. I mean, this is what Tony Benn said years ago. All you've got if you are relatively poor is your vote. And if you don't go and use it, then you're never going to get anything out of the society because they're not going to do anything for you. And of course, they're deliberately rigging, and they're hoping that by doing this, they'll manage to survive. You know, that there'll be some kind of.
This is vote rigging, isn't it? But in this case, by the Electoral Commission. So what they're saying is, from the 4th of May 2023, just before the local elections, handily, voters in England will now need to show photo ID. Right.
And the bus pass
Many people do not have photo ID.
Yeah,
probably about a quarter or even a third of the population do not have photo ID handy. Maybe a passport, maybe a driving licence, whatever.
Yeah, but you can't. Things like a pensioner's bus pass, which has got a photo on it.
How about my union card?
No, because it's got no photo on it.
It has.
All right, but it still won't count. Yeah, and this has been brought in from the US, and I think it's going to be there's going to be we must try and anybody who hasn't got any ID should turn up to the polling station and try and vote, because we want some figures on who was turned away.
Exactly. This will apply to local elections, police and crime commissioner elections, UK parliamentary by-elections and recall petitions. From October 2023, it will also apply to UK general elections. So very well done for bringing that up, Martin. It's, I mean, unbelievable.
You can see.
Is there any evidence of widespread fraud?
In Northern Ireland, there used to be a bit of an issue about it.
What about postal votes?
They brought in photo ID in Northern Ireland already.
Can you send in?
And what's happened is it's just pushed the. They tend to have fairly high turnouts compared to the rest of the country because it's a more stressful situation. But by bringing this photo ID thing, it's pushed down turnout in Northern Ireland. That's what it does. And of course, it's designed in the US. In the US, in many states, if you've got any kind of criminal conviction, you can't vote. So the police go around arresting young black males, for example, doing them for possession of marijuana. They can never vote again, ever, and that is quite deliberate. It's called voter suppression, and it's a Republican activists and corporate people, they spend a lot of time thinking, how can we weed through the electoral register? We want as few people on the electoral register as possible. And of course, if you think back historically, the voters were householders. They had to be householders. This was one of the main issues in the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland in the 1960s. At local elections, only householders could vote. So you didn't get a vote just for being an adult. You had to be a householder.
I think some of these things are, possibly connected. Talking about the ULEZ, and you might throw in the cashless society as well into all of this. That what you're creating is a sense among people that there's a managerial elite who are, imposing controls down through society that are designed to shut people out.